Hi everyone, welcome to my impromptu art classroom. Today I'm going to be taking you through the fundamentals in watercolor painting. Watercolor is a painting medium that has been around for centuries. It's wonderful in regards to creating expressive and impressionistic pieces. It's also a great test of patience and control and time management. And there are so many things to learn about watercolor that can completely change your piece and to make it uniquely yours. I'm going to be time stamping everything laid out in units in this long video. That being said, I'm also going to pull out some of my painting content within this and uploading it separately as edutainment. If you look below in the description, you'll see timestamps. Click on any of those timestamps if the title beside it is what you want to learn about. I would suggest, if you're not knowledgeable about watercolor, please take the time and watch this whole video through. It can really help you. And if you are advanced, I would click through and look and see if there's any techniques or anything you need to know about watercolor chemistry that would help you in furthering your education in watercolor. I'm not going to be teaching you how to paint anything specific in this course. I will be painting specific images in this course. I just want to show you aspects of painting in watercolor that can help you step over that initial fear of getting into watercolor. I myself was trained at the Savannah College of Art and Design. I am a designer by trade and in work. I fell back in love with watercolor 2 years ago. I had randomly bought a really nice watercolor palette a long time ago, probably 8 years ago. Someone reminded me that I had it 2 years ago, and so I picked it back up and started painting with it. And at first I thought, why would I ever use watercolor? It's so annoying. It was really frustrating. The next day I thought, I want to watercolor again. I really want to get back in there and I want to watercolor again. I went ahead and I did a bunch of research on watercolor techniques, what makes watercolor. Those things I think are very important if you want to step into that world. And I will be using things I learned in college, things I learned on my own, things I learned from the Artist Handbook, which I suggest you get no matter what level of artist you are, and the All About Techniques in Watercolor by Behrens, which I also suggest that you get because that breaks down a lot of what I'm going to say in this unit and gives you picture reference, which is great. So let's get started. Watercolor comes in 4 states. Solid watercolor, which is prepared in a pan or a pot. Creamy watercolor, which comes in a tube. Liquid or pourable watercolor, which is also known as aquarelle, which comes in a bottle, and pencil. The pricing on watercolor tends to vary based on the quality of pigments in the paint. Good quality paints, you will see the difference when you execute a painting because the higher quality watercolor can accept large amounts of water to dilute it without losing its pigment. And that's the difference. It's all about the density. Watercolors are rated from artist grade, the highest, to student grade. There's no standardization of this label, and unfortunately now we see labels like expert and premium in commercial grade watercolors. You need to look at light fastness, which says whether the paints are going to fade in the sun, and the density. But a lot of companies don't even give that information out, so it can be difficult. Let's go through the states of watercolors and their pros and cons. So we'll start with solid. Solid has more gum arabic in it. You get the pans, they have cute little pots in them filled with a solid pigment watercolor, and then you wet that, and then you use your brush to take paint out of those pans and mix them with water and other colors. There's less humectant in this paint, which means it's less creamy, obviously because it's a solid. It is more portable, so you can take pans on the go with you very easily. as opposed to single packaged liquid colors and creamy colors. Some of the cons of solid watercolor are that the pans are small. And when you get them, they're labeled with a sticker. I personally do not mind this, but many people, this drives them crazy. I take the time and I go ahead and I delabel and relabel all my pans. Some of my pans come wrapped in foil with a sticker on top notating the color. And like these by Arteza just have a sticker wrapped around them, which I just ripped off and made sure that the color code and color title were on there. I have not found singly wrapped refills pans. I have a set of $600 watercolors in which a roommate stole and used up the black and the Caucasian flesh tone that was in it. I cannot find these singularly anywhere, and I don't want to buy another $600 palette of paint. It can be difficult to find replacements, and you can't use cream watercolors and refill those pans with them. There's not a lot of planning ahead with solid watercolors. You look at the color, it's right in front of you, you can visualize what you want, and you can make your mixes there on your palette paper in the top of the palette box. However, you're not going to be able to make large amounts of color, and mixing again and again tends to cause color discrepancies. So that can be a little frustrating. Solid is probably one of the worst watercolor states for doing overall washes. When you want to do gradients, when you want to do atmospheric washes, or you just want to tint your paper, solid watercolor really isn't the easiest for that. You want to use a creamy watercolor and you want to dilute that with water, or an aquarella liquid watercolor from the bottle, and use a larger brush, and that creates a much smoother transition when you give washes over your piece. Creamy or tube watercolor comes with more humectant in it, and humectant is what gives it its smooth creaminess. That's usually composed of honey or some form of glycerin. The pros of this are that it dries slowly, so it's more workable for a longer period of time. It's really great for detail work and small brush work, but it's also really wonderful for large format. When you want to cover large areas of your art piece and you want to just make a large wash, or you want to paint really good graphic work, tube seems to be the most advantageous for artists. That being said, you can't see the pigment until you put it out. You have to know how much of the pigment you're going to use, which is one of the cons, because you're pushing it out of the tube onto your palette and then mixing the color that you want. So if you squirt this whole tube out, that's it. You better use it or you're wasting it. Most of the tube watercolors do not re-wet. They crack and they become crumbly, and you will see that in your painting. But again, for large format, tube is the way to go. Liquid or aquarelle, I don't use. This is a great watercolor for graphics artists. If you think of people who want really clean lined graphics and, very much like screen print type graphics, aquarelle is great. Mixing it is difficult. The intensities vary from color to color and bottle to bottle. You may think you're mixing a blue red and a blue to get a purple, and it turns out more blue. It's a difficult medium, but graphic artists tend to gravitate towards it. Pencil I have not really used, but I'm going to start using it as my sketching medium before I use my tube and pan solid watercolors. Now, the reason for that is that I don't love graphite lines in my drawings, and I want to sketch directly on the paper before I paint. That being said, the pros of that is that the line stays in the graphite. The cons are that sometimes you can see it through the watercolor, because watercolor is translucent. You can layer and layer and layer watercolors and get the effects still of stained glass. It never goes opaque. However, even when you're using dark colors, the silvery graphite tends to show through. Now, the other side of that is these colored pencils that are watercolor colored pencils. And so how people use them is they wet the paper first and then draw, which causes the pigment to immediately bleed, or they draw and then wet the pigment. And so they have a little bit more control on where the pigment goes while using a brush or a spray bottle after the fact. The one good thing about that is that your lines will disappear once you start to paint. If you do your sketch in a very light color or a relative color to what your painting is going to look like. However, the other thing is that once the line is gone, it's gone. If you want to use that line for reference in the future and it's not there, forget it. You're going to have to wait for your application to dry, and you're going to have to draw again on top of that. So that being said, let's go ahead and move into paper types. Okay, art papers. Paper in general consists of a wood pulp, an adhesive, and water. But artist papers also come in cotton, and the nickname for cotton is rag. So if you've ever heard of rag vellum or rag illustration board, that's cotton. The best kind of paper for watercolor is 100% cotton. The reason for that is that cotton as a non-woven is very workable. When you get into watercolor techniques, there are negative watercolor techniques where you remove color with your brush or with a paper towel or a sponge. If you are using a paper that has a small amount of cotton in it, it will likely get damaged, as you can see here in a portrait I did of one of my old roommates. There is gelatin in paper. So for those of you who are vegan, you're going to have to find a synthetic version, which you should ask directly about. But my experience in the art supply stores is there's always at least one person who works there who loves talking about paper. So you got to find that one person in the store and open up a conversation, and you can spend hours there looking at different papers, and they will take you through everything, and they're glad to do it. The paper is treated with something called size. Size keeps the paper, one, protected, but two, it makes it so that it is less absorbent of the watercolor. If you were to paint directly onto cotton paper, your color would go right into the fibers and it would become muddy. It would not be as pretty. The sizing keeps the vibrancy and makes it so that the paint stays on top of the paper that you are using. That being said, when you go into techniques like wetting paper and things like that, you have to be careful that you don't remove the sizing from the paper, or you'll end up ruining the paper for the watercolor. There is an alkaline substance that is added to the paper making process because paper naturally oxidizes. And that's why when you see old medieval papers and things like that, they're basically a ochre color. It's from oxidization, among other factors. But the alkaline substance is added when the paper is in pulp form, and it's also an antifungal. So it can prolong the longevity of the paper because it keeps it from molding or getting weird bacteria in it. Some of the most famous brands of watercolor paper are Arches, Whatman, Fontenay, Fabriano, Winsor & Newton, and Hammer. I use Arches. Even in the pad form, they are extremely consistent, and they are always in great sized formats for me. I like to work a little bit bigger than letter size. But I know that the 100% cottons are more expensive. So there are brands like Arteza. Arteza has two types of 100% cotton paper that work wonderfully. And for the costs, they're amazing. They are in small format. They don't come in large format. You will not be able to do large 18 by 24s with this paper. I think the largest size is 9 by 12. But I do recommend when you're getting a start to splurge on cotton paper, because once you go to 100% cotton paper, you will never look back unless you intend on using a different paper surface for a different paint effect. And I've outlined that in a Amazon packaging video, which I will link below, but it's also in my playlist. It's one of my most recent videos. Paper comes in weight. The weight that is notified is how much a ream of the paper weighs, or grams per square meter. Paper comes in 90 pound to 300 pound weight. And what you need to know about that is going to tell you, one, where your price point is going to be. The higher the pound weight, the more expensive the paper is. But two, anything above 140 pounds does not need to be stretched. It will not warp when you apply watercolor. However, that is not always the case with large format paintings. I recommend that if you are going above 9 by 12, you try and stretch that paper before you use it and dry it out. And I will go through those techniques here in this video. The papers that you can get come in pads, they come in sheets, they come in rolls as well. And the rolls are usually 10 yards. I recommend the rolls because you can keep it forever, you can cut any format and any shape, and you're usually saving money when you buy the roll. I know that some of the rolls are $100, but it's so many sheets of paper when you calculate it down to what a pad costs. There is cold pressed and hot pressed. Hot pressed is considered to have a smoother texture, and cold pressed has more of a slubby textural appearance, which many people love. I personally like hot pressed. I like smooth finish. I like more of a graphic quality, which comes from that. And cold press will give you more of a rustic look. I suggest in practice that you start with cold pressed because it's easier to learn on cold press. It's not as finicky as hot pressed. Now, brushes. All right, let's go into brushes. This is going to be somewhat controversial because the information about brushes also is not standardized. And when you get into animal products that are sourced from other countries, it becomes quite controversial because you're dealing with animal rights, you're dealing with sourcing protections and worker protections, and we don't have a lot of transparency in the art world. When it comes to brushes and paint materials, the art world tends to still be very medieval with the amount of animal products that are in it, and that's unfortunate. But what I can say is that new technologies are making synthetic brushes very competitive to what's on the market. So your brushes come in natural, they come in synthetic, and they come in bristle. One way to think of it is that a natural hair, like the hair on my head or on say a weasel or a squirrel, comes to a point. It's a strand of hair and it comes to one single point. Bristle, which comes from a hog, comes to multiple points. It's almost got like a jagged end to the hair follicle. So the paint is applied very differently when you use these different types of brushes. So some attributes of brushes that you need to consider are absorbency, hardness, flexibility, structure, size, which is known as the ferrule width. The ferrule is where the hairs are connected together inside the metal piece on the brush. There is no standardization on what a ferrule width number means. So it goes from brand to brand. A size 8 from one brand is not a size 8 from another. So I would suggest going cheap first and then growing your collection one brush at a time. What I will say is that if you have a size 8 brush, you do not need a size 9 or a size 7. Take further steps in between the sizes that you purchase to be more economic, because it doesn't make sense to buy all of them. One thing to note is that paintbrushes go all the way up to size like 24 and above. But when they hit 0, it was as if someone could invent a smaller brush after that, so they just added more zeros. The more zeros you see on your thickness size chart means it's smaller than 0. It's kind of like when girls' jeans go to 00. Make sure that you buy a paintbrush dryer that either comes with a cup or goes on top of a cup that you already have. It's basically a horizontal spring pulled taut, and you slide your brushes in there with the brush pointed downwards towards the cup. And that way, all of the water from inside your brush is pulled by gravity away from the ferrule. If the ferrule holds water, it ends up ruining your brushes. Leaving your brushes in the water, leaving them on their sides, it doesn't work. I know a lot of people who tie a small leather ribbon around the backs of their brushes and then just hang them from a thumbtack on the wall so that the bristles hang down and the water drips out. You have round brushes, which means that the metal ferrule is round. The brushes are organized in a radial form. That means your paintbrush can go in any direction. With flat paintbrushes, you have many more shape options in regards to the brush. However, you can only go 2 ways with the paintbrush, so that's something to consider. Let's talk about the dirty work. Now, just like makeup brushes, artist brushes are not consistent. You cannot collect hair from different animals and expect that it will all be the same. When you see these paintbrushes that are $200 each and they say that they come from some rare exotic animal, it doesn't necessarily make it better. And in fact, you're probably feeding into a much more corrupt system than you even know. Let's go ahead and get into the natural hairs and talk about what changes that. At the top of the line, you have sable. Sable is known because the hair strand comes to a super fine tip. So when organized together, you have a really clean line that comes from a sable brush. The varying pressures that you use with a sable brush change the line a lot. Sable is a weasel. There's a specific Siberian weasel called the Kolinsky, and so Kolinsky sable brushes are super rare, and they're super bad for the environment. Like, it's really irresponsible to be using these, but people covet them because they have a high price tag and apparently a painterly stroke like no other. Those range anywhere from $120 to $280 per brush. That weasel is on the endangered species list, and still it has become somewhat of like a poacher's game to get the hair from them. Imitation sable is usually just chemically treated ox hair. So imitation sable is still animal. There is a type of brush called Mimik Kolinsky, M-I-M-I-K. This is a synthetic which claims to be as close as possible to the Kolinsky Sable brush. I do not have one. They are very affordable, but I have heard great things. But if you're vegan, there's plenty of synthetic options out there for you, even in the upper end luxury range. Squirrel haired brushes comes from Canadian or Russian squirrels. It is more economical, it's priced better, and it holds a lot of paint in the head of the paintbrush when you're painting. So you'll notice that if you dip it into a large amount of watercolor, it will hold a large amount of watercolor, which means you can make continuous strokes for a lot longer, or you can flood areas for a lot longer with color. The alternative to that is called synthetic Neptune squirrel. Mongoose is protected species, and yet again there are still brushes on the market that claim to be mongoose hair. I don't know how this is happening. The alternative is Teijin, which is a synthetic. It's called Teigin, Teijin. They are considered to be sturdy brushes, absorbent, and the end of the brush makes a wonderful tip for precision painting as well. Goat is just considered a more economic and lower quality squirrel brush. Ox hair, which comes from the inside of the ox's ear. Watercolor is not kind to oxen, I will tell you that. The ox hair is stiffer. It doesn't quite vary as much in the widths of the brush strokes and things like that. You then have blends, which are blends of natural hairs and synthetic hairs, which some people think is the best way of creating a paintbrush because it gives you the bounce back and the consistency of a synthetic, but also it holds a lot of paint as a natural hair does. Synthetics are a technology of brush that are getting better and better by the day, and quite frankly they range from extremely economic to very high luxury. The only call out to synthetic brushes is that as a brush they don't hold as much water and pigment in them when you dip them in the paint and then use them. So you'll notice with brush pens who carry the water in the body of the pen, you're making a lot of short strokes as opposed to long, really liquid and smooth strokes. So it's something to consider. Lastly, you have bristle. Bristle is hog's hair. It's taken from the loin of the hog. I don't know if the hog is then butchered. This seems strange to me. But the other thing that's a little scary is that the main producer of bristle brushes is China. And we know categorically China does not have good animal rights laws because they do not believe as a culture that animals are anything other than an object to be harvested. So now I'm going to get into some tools and some things you might want to have while you are painting. Even when you're just starting off, it's worth it to get creative with some of the things that you use. There are plenty of freebie options that I'll talk to you about, but let's dive in. So you're going to need 2 cups of water. And one is going to be where you dip your paintbrush in to clean off the pigment in between color changes. And that water is going to muddy up very, very fast. Then you are going to dip your paintbrush into the next cup, which will be much cleaner because it will only be receiving pigment from the wash-off water. It's not enough to cloud that up. But you will then be able to easily stick your brush back into a different color and not muddy it up. Palettes, they come in ceramic, plastic, metal, or you can use glass like a printmaker. I personally prefer the tops of my pan tins. As you can see, this plastic one from Marie's gets a lot of use. One thing I will say is that the plastic ones tend to stain. If you have a pigment that does stain plastic, it's very important that you know that. The metal ones are powder coated, so they will not stain. glass will not stain. And the ceramic ones are really great because you can mix a lot of product in them. And they even have ones that let you put pigment out on them in little indentations and then mix in larger indentations. I just don't have one of those. I've never had the need for it. Also, for a freebie, my eggs that I buy by the dozen come in plastic egg containers, and they work perfectly for mixing colors because the top is one large basin and then the bottom of the carton when it's opened up is 12 smaller basins. So you can mix a lot of colors in there. It also works well for gouache. It does stain, but at the end of the day, you can just throw it away or recycle it. When you get ready and you have your piece of paper and you want to start sketching, I suggest you sketch multiple times before you actually write on the watercolor paper. You want to get a final sketch finished before you transfer it to your watercolor paper. I know that sounds like a lot of work, but you can work in thumbnail size and then blow it up to use it, trace it, or just redraw it with a reference onto your watercolor paper. What you need to know about graphite is that graphite, when you're drawing and sketching on your paper, the number here, 2HB, means 2 hard soft. So this is, I believe, what was required in school systems, but when you have a number from 0 to whatever, 100, and it says B, it means that the graphite within the pencil gets softer and softer and softer the higher the number. That being said, H means it's hard. So when you go 0 to 100 H, the graphite is getting harder and harder. Soft graphite, B graphite, is very easy to use. It's very easy to draw with, and it's darker. It shows up darker. It can leave remnants of the graphite pigment even after you erase. That being said, harder graphite, the H-rated graphites, are much more technical looking. The graphite is cleaner lined. It is a quieter silver gray or gunmetal color. However, because it's hard, graphite that is in the H range can easily mar the surface of your paper. So you have to kind of pick and choose what's your poison of choice, because either if you're very hard-handed, well, one, you shouldn't be, but two, you really need to think about what kind of pencil you're laying down the guidelines with, because they could be permanent. I use kneaded eraser to take the lines off of the drawing, or I just go in with a 2HB Ticonderoga. I buy them in bulk and I just draw very, very lightly. My sketches tend to look like chicken scratch, so I will go in and clean up all the extra lines, but overall, I don't mind a little bit of graphite showing through it. It tends to show process, and because watercolor tends to be such an organic medium with a little mess-ups and impressionist areas in it, I like to see graphite and the artist process coming through. Charcoal is soft. It can work well, but charcoal as a sketching medium leaves little granules of charcoal on the paper. That being said, you can erase charcoal, and when you go down to lay down your watercolor, it can still pick up gray particles and muddy your paint. So I don't recommend charcoal unless you want it to be a part of the aesthetic. All of these things I'm saying, if you want them to be a part of the aesthetic, they're not pros and cons, they're just differences in medium. Blotting paper, I would suggest you have that for after you pull your brushes out of the cleaner water to take some of the extra water off. You can use India ink. India ink is sold in solid and liquid form. The solid is for brushes, like watercolor brushes, but the liquid is for pen nibs. So if you want to do pen work, I do recommend after your watercolor is done to use India ink. You will want a sponge, paper towels, masking tape or artist tape, push pins, cotton balls, Q-tip. You can buy blades. Blades are really helpful, like an X-Acto knife or just a simple utility knife. You can buy artist supplies like Resist, which is a liquid that you paint down on the paper, and anything underneath the paper will stay. Nothing will attach as you apply it above the resist. So when you remove the resist, you get a batik fabric kind of situation going on, where the layers underneath are more prevalent because they have nothing over top of them. If you buy gum arabic, it's a thickener. You can put it in the paint water before you mix it in with the paint pigments. It's gonna increase the transparency, the translucency of the watercolor. It's also gonna give it a shine. But if you use too much of it and you thicken it too much, you can get cracking. So it's something to consider. If you like the crackling effect, then you just add gum arabic. It can help in control when you do thicken the watercolor a little bit. Ox gall. Again, oxen don't have it good. Ox gall is bile from oxen. It's a wetting agent, and it makes your watercolor more fluid without reducing the saturation of the color. I don't recommend using that. I really try to stay away from animal products. I have a couple of animal hair brushes, but it's just bizarre when you think about how dark age it is. Aquapasto, which is gum arabic and silicone mixed together. This makes your painting resistant to cracking. It's mixed 50 and 50 with the water. It's just something you can put on to help your painting last longer. Rubbing alcohol. Alcohol makes your paintings dry very quickly. They also make your pigments within your paints flood very quickly. So you lose a lot of control when you add alcohol. If the surface is wet, the alcohol will spread across the entire thing. So it can give you abrupt transitions between pigments, which is really strange that it would spread a lot but also give you these hard edges, but it just does that. Glycerin. So this is a humectant. It's great for if you are working outside in the sun and the heat. I don't recommend you work in the sun. If you can put an umbrella over you, that would be amazing. It extends the drying time of your paint, so they're much more workable. And I've used it before in working outside in the garden, and using a little bit made my watercolors produce a picture like they would indoors in a controlled environment. Varnish. Varnish is used as a fixative for illustrators or for painters. It protects the color and the longevity of your watercolor. One thing you need to remember is that varnish will always change the finish of your painting. So even matte finish varnish is going to have a little bit of varnish look to it. But you can get it in a pretty consistent matte finish where it isn't too visible. But you can also use varnish to your advantage and turn certain areas in your image to high gloss and the other way around. So it's, again, another attribute to watercolor painting where you can change the entire concept of your painting just with high gloss and matte finishes. Take a popsicle break. Take a popsicle break. Take a popsicle break. Unless it's winter, then you're going to take a hot chocolate break. Take a hot chocolate break. Let's go ahead and discuss gradated washes, or gradients as we like to call them. You're going to see a color gradually pale from one side to the other. And in this case, in watercolor, with just one color, it will always fade to the color of the paper. In this case here, I'm using Arteza 140-pound white watercolor paper in 100% cotton or rag. A lot of times people will use gradated washes as the water in their painting or the sky in their backgrounds, but there's other applications you can use it in, but these are generally the most prolific. You can gradate watercolor paint with the dry method or the on wet method. And that just means the paper. So if the paper is wet, you can do a gradation on that, or you can do it on dry paper, which requires you work the paint a little bit more. I will say that it can be difficult if you want to experiment on a non-expensive piece of paper. For this to be most successful, I think you just have to go about this confidently. Don't try to touch it up. Don't try to mess with it too much until after it's dried. I'll show you what that means when I go with this one. But first I'm going to be showing you the one color gradient. Then I'm going to be showing you two color starting from the opposite side. So what that looks like when the white is not showing through. So on dry paper, you're going to get the most saturated gradient. It's going to be a gradient that you have to work more with the brush. It's best to do this on paper that's been stretched, and you'll see why in a minute. But you're going to go ahead and pick your color, and you're going to apply paint to the upper part of the paper. Now, one thing I would suggest here that I did not do is that I would use paint from a tube, because this is again a wash. So mixing large amounts of pan solid paint, and water is quite tedious, especially when you're trying to do large washes. I used color right directly from the pan, and I still was mixing more and more water with the paint. Apply the color as if you're just doing a flat wash. You just paint the color across, say, the top. We'll start with the top. You're then going to add a lot of water into your brush. You're going to repeat doing this and going down or along with your gradient while dipping back into the water. So you're going to be procuring a lot of water onto the paper. So it helps if it's been pre-stretched. If you want your gradient to be darker, you always add paint from the starting point and then gradate it down towards the vanishing point. Don't add a line in the middle, or you will get an interruption to your gradient. You will get to the point when you're using one color that you eventually just won't have any color left on the brush and you're just working with water. And that's kind of what I had here. This is cold pressed paper, so you can see the texture better in this, whereas in hot pressed it wouldn't do this. One thing that can be trying about this is that because you're working on a dry surface, you have to do this quickly. You can't just go about it like painting one line, waiting, and painting the next. You have to do this all in one swoop. Now, as you can see, I've created a blue gradient, and now I'm going back in and touching up with water. One mistake that I made is that I painted purple lower in the gradient. I then had to work that color back up towards the starting point, which is very tedious and time consuming, and I do not recommend it. You'll also see I added blue to deepen that violet color. Started to like what I was seeing better, but it all felt very light to me. One thing you need to remember is that watercolors dry a lot lighter than they look wet. Another thing that I noticed was as more and more water was applied, the paper began to warp. Not only that, but the granules of pigment within my paint, and this is an economy paint, started to show up and they started to pool. I don't necessarily mind this because I don't want my gradient to be perfect, but if you're a graphic design artist, this is not what you would want. So one thing you can do is you can use your brush, dry it off, and you can subtract some of the water off your painting surface. For the on wet gradation, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing as before, but this time the paper is damp. So I don't have to be quite as fast with this technique. I'm going to be dipping into, I believe, dark blue. The important thing to know is when you're doing color gradients like this, and with anything in watercolor, you need to start with the lightest color and end with the darkest color. So the dark blue that I'm going to be using here on the bottom, I'm going to be amplifying this color a lot. However, it needs to happen after the violet purple because the violet purple was much, much lighter. One thing you'll notice is as I'm applying the blue, it is starting to spread a lot differently, and it is very granular. So there are a lot of granular pigments showing up in the paint. And that's mainly because it's floating in the water. There's so much water on the surface of that paper at this point. You're going to continue to work the pigment up from the beginning point, and that's how you're going to deepen your tones. I was hitting an area here where there just was too much water and I wasn't able to work it anymore. I just decided to get the gradation as smooth as I could, and then I would leave it and let it dry, and that's what I did. I like to leave a little bit of really light space in the middle, but the final product was really nice. I'd like to discuss tone, and tone would be the different shade values of a pigment color. And here I'm using a cerulean blue, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a circle template from my architecture kit, and I will create 6 of the same circle so that they all have the same weight and mass. But I'm going to paint them in different dilutions of watercolor, and you can kind of do this yourself and play on the perspective that you can get just with one color. Obviously, the size of the circle would change the perspective, or any overlap between the circles would change perspective and would give you depth. But this is just going to be side by side, and I'm going to play around with the different tones to see if I can get some of the circles to come forward off the paper and some of them to recede back to the background. And this will be just an exercise that I think you can do in a sketchbook. You don't need to do this on a prepared sheet, but it'd be interesting to see how many tones you can get from one color. You can get a lot. Start from light and go to dark. I did not do that here. It's easier that way. And try it out. Mix yourself some color, paint all the circles, make multiple layers if you let them dry in between, or try just using water in one single layer. It just depends on what you want, but you can create a lot of dimension with different tones of the same color with watercolor. With the violet paint, I'm just trying to see what kind of line widths and how much paint actually one dip holds in the brush. And as you can see, it's quite a lot. But I always suggest that you have some kind of sheet like this that you can kind of mess around with. It also helps that when you're working on your final piece, that you have something like this on the side to where you can test colors before you actually apply them to your final painting. So we're going to get into an actual painting now. This was 20 minutes. So I wanted to go ahead and take you through a painting and execution, and basically how I go through sketching and then beginning to paint my pieces. What I referenced was a photo on Google, which I can't use because it's not mine, of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But what I thought this would exemplify is the concept of atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is when you look at things in the distance outdoors, they tend to turn blue and almost merge with the sky. That is because there are more and more air molecules between you and the object, and over time that begins to have the same visual representation as if it were water. The Blue Ridge Mountains are specific for this, so I thought it would be interesting to paint them. The other thing I'm doing here is I'm only using 2 colors. I'm only using green or blue in this painting. I highly suggest that when you start doing watercolor painting, you use 1 to 2 colors to really start getting momentum in composition, in texture, in contrast, and in mixing. It makes your life so much easier when you give yourself those kind of constraints when you are beginning to paint. And that's not to say you have to leave that realm. There are plenty of artists out there who make wonderful paintings and have amazing careers on using monochromatic color schemes. So now I'm taking the lightest blue dilution of my cerulean, and I'm just giving a little bit of contour to the clouds. In the photo that I referenced, there is a huge hole in gray storm clouds that the sun is coming through. And so I want to eventually amplify that in the painting. However, I just want to mark where it is. I use a ruler to keep my hand clean. A lot of people use a piece of paper. I just like the feeling of resting my hand on a metal ruler. But I start with the lightest mountains, the lightest blue, and then I work forward. There's a couple things about this picture that are really interesting. The sky lends to be more gray because it's stormy, and the foreground, the mountain that the photographer was closest to, happens to be the only area in direct sun. So the greens in the foliage and the textures are very, very high contrast and very pronounced from the blue backgrounds. But I just want to give you a lead into how to do something in a semi-impressionist way with a limited color palette that gets the message across. As I work my way further towards the viewer, I start adding more blue pigments into the painting. One thing to consider here is I'm working on a dry surface. I did not wet the paper beforehand. I did not want heavy bleeding because I wanted to be messy with my brush stroke and for that to be more of an impressionist ideal behind the landscape. So I'm just adding more blue. Eventually I'll start implementing some dark blue and some green to relate it to the foreground. Another thing to consider is that in the perspective, the mountains in the background are very simple shapes, but when you get closer to the viewer, you can see things like treetops or small animals or rocks, and that gives a much different silhouette. And you need to show that when you paint. You need to show some kind of difference, even if it's just hinted at. I hold my brush behind the halfway point. I think it gives much more painterly appeal to the watercolor when it's finished, and it also it's just nicer on your hand as opposed to holding it like a pencil. Sometimes I change it when I'm doing like little detail works or if I'm not paying attention, but I try to make a conscious effort to really hold the paintbrush from far back so it's very feminine and very smooth. Here I'm painting the second row of mountains, and what's interesting about this is that in the photograph these were actually black because there was a heavy cloud over this area, and so it even was more pronounced from the foreground, which is super bright. I haven't really drawn the foreground at this point. I kind of marked on the left side where a little pine tree will be, but I'm just laying down such light colors, I'm not that worried about it. And you don't need to be worried about it either. You can obviously subtract color, but you don't need to worry too hard if you paint an area that you want to be lighter. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more pigment, but then I'm going to let this dry. And then I'm going to come back. And when I come back, I'm going to start working on more of the objects that are in the painting and less contours of the landscape. Now I'm mixing new colors. These are going to have a lot more green. I really want to deepen up the second row of mountains. And this is the one row of mountains where you can really see treetops. So I'm going to be going back in with that. But I just want to add more intensity here. with how light everything dried. I'm going to also be adding in the ridges in the mountain, so the areas of shade that aren't actually hit by the sun, which are massive swaths of land, but they're just little slivers off in the distance. So you'll see, and then I'll try to blend those back in. But just keep in mind that I'm still working on a dry surface here. This is a watercolor pen. So the brush is a synthetic, and it has a water basin in the body of the pen. You can squeeze water out as you paint, but I just love this for its illustrative qualities. I think it really helps with control when you have issues with control, which I do. At this point, I pretty much have the shade and light zones of the mountains mapped out. This by no means are the final colors of what I want, but since it was super wet, I decided to make some gray and start in on those storm clouds. So I'm just starting from the top. I think the clouds were darkest at the top, and they got lighter towards that sunspot. The sunspot wasn't as ovular, but I just wanted to map it out in that way to remind myself that it was there. The perspective that this is at, the clouds were very flat because the photographer was so high up. So it's really interesting when the clouds almost form a ceiling in your painting, because when you look at paintings from the ground, the clouds tend to play this giant role. And in this one, although they were prominent, they took a much smaller real estate in the composition, which I thought was really interesting. So at this point, I started adding black. So now we're at blue, green, and black. Just because I didn't have a dark enough blue in this palette to really deepen up and get some good grays. That's something to consider when you're constructing your own palette, is maybe just pull primary colors with different undertones, black, white if you want, and like maybe a couple of neutrals, and just put that in a travel palette and take that with you. This size of paint pan is called a half pan. I prefer a whole pan, especially with larger brush strokes. I don't think this is enough paint. I'd rather have larger amounts of paint and less colors than large amounts of colors and less paint. So I'm just trying to get detailings into the clouds. I'm making them much more stormy looking and sinister, hoping that some of the water, they bleed out a bit. But the mountains had started to dry, and so I started going back in with some really deep colors to pop out the ones closer into the foreground. You'll notice I start going back and forth between the sky and the ground. And the reason for that is one, because this is such a concise color palette, I can get away with hopping back and forth because both areas are going to have to relate. But also, I want them to relate as an artist. I want the clouds to speak visually to the mountains. And that's why I'm focusing here on the second and third ridge of mountains, or stage of mountains, that fall underneath that stormy area in the sky, because I love that contrast, and I think that contrast sets the stage for the foreground to really pop off. So now we're going to get into some of the detail work. What you'll notice here is, before I start off, is that the water has collected and pooled on my painting and has created these large puddle areas that have dried where the pigment has collected at the edge of the water. This also happened in the gradient print, as you saw, and that's just a matter of making sure you don't leave too much water on your paper if you do not like that aesthetic. I do not mind that aesthetic, and I'm going to be painting over this anyways because I'm going to be adding lots of black and yellow and high contrast, so it doesn't really matter to me. So I'm continuing to zone some of the areas in the mountains, but this time I'm using a different paint stroke. I'm dappling the brush in a black green, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to hint or allude at treetops in this hazy type of color. I will go back in with the darker and be more precise about those contours or those outlines of those shapes or silhouettes, but I still want the color to kind of reflect the aura of that shape being there. These trees are pine trees. They're deep, dark, heavy greens. They're beautiful, but they're just little tiny, like toothpick-sized trees at this point. Even when I paint like the dappling style within a region that's zoned the same color, it still starts to show with watercolor. You start to produce a texture. So now I'm starting to paint the foliage in the foreground. And as you can tell, I'm cheating. I am now adding yellow to the painting. But I think it's still, I'm keeping it in the green zone. It works nicely, and I think that the product will still speak a cohesive colorway, and I'm really excited to show you. A couple things I do as an artist is that I frame my paintings with color. So if you'll notice in the corners of the paintings, I like to deepen up the color, and that's not naturally how the photograph looked at all. In fact, some of the corners were very bright. However, for me, I like a clean understanding of the boundaries of the artwork, so I like to augment that reality. Here I am adding more contours to the trees in the mountains behind the main foreground. I'm kind of almost done with those, I think, at this point. I'm adding a little bit to the mountains behind that, but this was actually a mistake. This color is way too dark for that fourth row of mountains. Here I'm using brush strokes to create foliage shapes. So we have long triangular leaves, we have big grasses, and we're going to have some conifer pine trees. And most of these were a yellow-green variety. They didn't have much contrast between each other than shape. So I am changing the colorway a little bit to make some of the plants blue-green and some of them more yellow-green. I'm faking some of the shading with a tone of green that's much deeper and more relative to like the pine tree color. It's giving the plants a mass and giving them weight in the piece. There's a huge tuft of large grasses in this piece in the foreground, so now I'm just trying to create that movement. There's not a lot of wind in the photograph, so I just want to get a very confident stroke in the grasses so that they have prominence, because they're not going to have a ton of texture. They're not going to have too much value because they weren't very dark at the bottom. They were in bright sunlight. So now I'm starting on this pine tree. This is the one prominent tree in the photograph. And this one was a huge mistake. I took the organic form of the tree, and the tree was sparse and very elegant. The branches curled upwards to the sky, and then the sprigs of pine branches shot straight off of that. There wasn't a lot of branch splitting or anything like that. So the geometries of the tree was really elegant and almost looked like a leaf. However, I didn't pay attention to line weight. I made my lines way too thick, and you'll see I'm kind of hurrying through it. But I'm using a translucent black color because it was shaded. It was such a dark green, it read as black in the photograph. But I'm just trying to grab the geometries of the pine tree and put them in. This was the furthest thing away from the viewer on the first mountain. So this would be separating the visual from all this yellow foliage in the front from the blackened background, or the second row of mountains. After that, it's time to deepen in the foliage. The second row of mountains, I went in again with the black and started to deepen them up, and then continued to work my way around the foreground and deepen those different plants and leaves up so that I could get more contrast and more understanding of the objects that were right in front of the viewer. The black detailing is obviously the final detailing. It's what really, I think, brings the painting to life. You're starting to see more than just gray blobs. So I'll continue to pronounce certain contours and shade areas with dark green and black watercolor. I would like in the future to add black ink or pencil, which I will put in another video, to really pronounce the different textures and shapes within this painting. But overall, it turned out pretty well. And that's the end of this unit. I really hope that you all take something away from this and you feel more confident, if you haven't already, to start doing watercolor. And if you already have, I hope you took some information about the products that you're using or where to source certain information. If you have any questions or call outs, please put them below, or you can contact me at Instagram or on Twitter at the handle jcrafthouse. Thanks so much.